The wind that swept through Red Hollow in the late 1870s did not just blow, it scoured. It carried the red dust of the Texas borderlands, a grit that settled into the deep lines of men's faces and the folds of women's aprons, a constant reminder that this land did not welcome strangers. The sun was setting now, hanging low and heavy on the horizon like a piece of dying coal, casting long, distorted shadows across the single main street where a saloon, a weathered church, and the grim walls of the military outpost stood in an uneasy truce. They were three pillars of a civilization that felt very thin here, stretched tight over the wildness of the Indian Territory just beyond the river. Clara Monroe stood on the porch of the Monroe Ranch house, wiping her hands on a rag that was gray with old stains. She was 22 years old. Though the sun and the wind had already begun to etch the corners of her eyes, she was not delicate. Her shoulders were broad enough to carry water buckets without spilling a drop, and her hands were rough, calloused from chopping wood and mending fences, work that should have been done by the hired hands, if the Monroe Ranch could afford to keep more than one old man on the payroll. Inside the house, the air was still and stifling. It smelled of lavender water and boiled potatoes, a mixture that always made Clara feel slightly nauseous. This was the domain of Agnes, her stepmother, and Rose, her half-sister. Rose was 18, the golden child of the family, with hair the color of spun wheat and skin that Agnes guarded ferociously against the harsh Texas sun, while Clara was out in the heat ensuring the few remaining cattle did not stray. Rose sat in the parlor, embroidering handkerchiefs that no one in Red Hollow had the refinement to appreciate. Clara pushed open the screen door, the hinges groaning in protest. "Close it quickly," Agnes snapped from her rocking chair. "You are letting the dust in. Clara, Lord knows we'd fight a losing battle against the dirt in this God-forsaken place." "The water trough is full," Clara said, her voice low. She did not expect thanks, and she received none. "Good," Agnes said, not looking up from her knitting. "Now go wash yourself. You smell like a horse." Clara moved toward the kitchen, her boots heavy on the floorboards. She had long ago accepted her place in this house, when her father was alive. There had been laughter here, and he had looked at her with pride, calling her his strong right hand. But her father had been dead for 3 years, taken by a fever that burned him up in 3 days. And he had left the ranch and his daughters in the hands of a woman who viewed the frontier as a personal insult. To Agnes, Clara was a reminder of a life she did not want the daughter of a first wife, a creature of the outdoors, too tall, too quiet, and entirely too practical. The tension in the house had been palpable all day, thicker than the dust outside. Earlier that afternoon, a soldier from the fort had ridden up the drive, the brass buttons of his uniform glinting in the harsh light. He had delivered a letter sealed with wax, handed it to Agnes with a stiff nod, and ridden away without a word to Clara, who had been repairing the gate. Agnes had been reading and rereading that letter ever since. It sat now on the small side table next to the oil lamp, ominous in its stillness. Clara pumped water into a basin in the kitchen and scrubbed her face. The cool water felt like a blessing. Through the open door connecting the kitchen to the parlor, she could see Rose sitting by the window, looking pale and nervous. "What did the soldier want, Mama?" Rose asked, her voice trembling slightly. Rose was always trembling about something: spiders, thunder, the way the coyotes howled at night. Agnes stopped rocking. She picked up the letter, her fingers tracing the seal. "It is a proposition," she said slowly. "From the fort, from the government agents." Clara paused, the towel pressed to her face, listening. "Is it about the taxes?" Rose asked. "No," Agnes said. She stood up, her face hard and calculating. "It is about our safety and our future. You know the raids have been getting worse on the southern road. We cannot move our cattle to market if the wagons are burned before they reach the town line." "The Comanche," Rose whispered the word like a curse. "The Comanche," Agnes repeated. "Specifically, a band led by a war chief named Dakota Lone Hawk. The army has been trying to force him onto the reservation, but he is stubborn. He holds the pass near the river. The army is tired of fighting him, and he is tired of starving. Clara lowered the towel. She knew the name. Dakota Lone Hawk. The men in town spoke it with a mixture of hatred and grudging fear. They called him the bloody warrior of the Llano. They said he could shoot an arrow through a man at 300 yards and that he rode a horse as black as midnight. So there is a deal, Agnes continued, her eyes fixed on her beautiful daughter. A peace treaty of sorts. Dakota has agreed to stop the raids on the supply wagons. He has agreed to protect the ranchers in this valley from other tribes. In exchange, the government gives him supplies for the winter, but he demanded something else, something to ensure the bond is honored. What? Rose asked. A wife, Agnes said. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Wife. Rose's voice was barely a squeak. He is a widower, Agnes said, her tone devoid of emotion, like a merchant discussing the price of flour. He told the officers he wants a white woman, a bridge between his people and ours. He believes that if he has a white wife, the soldiers will be less likely to attack his camp while they sleep. And he is right. That is barbaric, Rose gasped. Who would agree to such a thing? Agnes turned her gaze fully upon Rose. It was a look of terrifying appraisal. The officer says Dakota specifically asked for a woman of good breeding. Young, healthy. He has been told of the Monroe sisters? Rose went white. She dropped her embroidery hoop. No, Mama, no. We have no money. Rose, Agnes hissed, her composure cracking. The ranch is failing. If we do not get that herd to market next month, we starve. This deal comes with a payment from the government, compensation for the sacrifice. It would save us. I would rather die, Rose cried out, jumping to her feet. He is a savage. He lives in dirt. He will scalp me while I sleep. Mama, please, you cannot send me to a monster. Clara stood in the shadows of the kitchen doorway, her heart hammering against her ribs. She watched her stepmother's face. She saw the desperation there, the greed, and the cold calculation. Agnes looked at Rose, her precious, fragile Rose, who fainted at the sight of blood, and then her eyes shifted. They moved past Rose, through the doorway, and locked onto Clara. The look that passed over Agnes's face chilled Clara to the bone. It was not hatred. It was worse. It was a sudden, practical realization. It was the look of a woman who realizes she has a spare part she does not need. Go to your room, Rose, Agnes said quietly. But Mama, go. Rose fled the room, sobbing. Agnes remained standing, staring at Clara. She did not say a word. She simply turned and placed the letter back on the table, then sat down and resumed her knitting. The rhythmic click-clack of the needles was the only sound in the house. Later that night, the house settled into an uneasy silence. Clara lay in her narrow bed in the small room off the kitchen, staring up at the cracked plaster of the ceiling. She could not sleep. The name Dakota Lone Hawk echoed in her mind. She thought of her father. He had been a hard man, but fair. He had never hated the natives the way the other townsfolk did. Once, when Clara was a child, he had found a wounded brave man near the creek. Instead of shooting him, her father had left water and dried meat. It is their land too. Clara, he had told her. We are just the ones drawing lines on it. Clara slipped out of bed. She moved silently, her bare feet making no sound on the floorboards. She needed to see the letter. She needed to know what kind of man traded protection for a human being. The parlor was dark, lit only by the embers dying in the hearth. Clara found the letter where Agnes had left it. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the heavy paper. She expected a scrawl, perhaps a dictation written by a soldier. But the handwriting was strong, angular, and surprisingly legible. It was written in English, likely by a mission-schooled hand, or perhaps Dakota himself had learned the language. Clara squinted in the dim light, reading the words. To the family of Monroe, I do not ask for gold. I have no use for the yellow metal that makes men crazy. I do not ask for your land. The land belongs to itself. I ask for a companion. My lodge is empty. My daughter has no mother. Winter is coming and it will be hard. I promise a sturdy lodge that does not leak. I promise horses that are strong and swift. I promise meat at the fire every night. I promise that the woman who comes to me will walk with her head high. She will not be a servant. She will be the heart of my home. I wait at the painted rock. Dakota Clara lowered the paper. Her breath caught in her throat. It was not the demand of a monster. There was no threat of violence in the ink. My daughter has no mother. He had a child, a little girl, and he promised respect. Clara looked around the dark parlor. This house was not a home to her. Here, she was a servant. She was the one who mucked out the stalls, who scrubbed the floors until her knees bled, who bore the brunt of Agnes's bitterness. She was 22, already considered a spinster by the town standards, with no dowry and no prospects. If she stayed here, her future was clear. She would work until her back broke, watching Rose marry a shopkeeper or a banker, while she remained the unwanted fixture in the corner. Dakota promised a lodge that did not leak. He promised she would not be a servant. A strange, terrifying thrill shot through her. It was madness. He was a Comanche warrior. He could kill her, but the letter spoke of a daughter. It spoke of loneliness. Suddenly, she heard voices from the kitchen. Agnes and Rose. They must have gone down for water. Clara froze, pressing herself into the shadows behind the high-backed armchair. "Cannot do it, Mama. I will kill myself first," Rose was sobbing softly. "Hush, child." Agnes's voice was sharp, but low. "Stop your crying. I have thought about it, and you are right. You were not born to live in a tent and sleep beside a wild Indian. You would perish in a week." "Then we refuse him?" Rose asked, hope rising in her voice. "We cannot refuse," Agnes said. "We need the money, and we need protection. If we say no, Briggs says the army will wash their hands of us. Then what do we do?" There was a pause, a long, heavy silence. "We sent him a bride," Agnes said. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, but in the quiet house, it carried clearly to Clara's ears. "He asked for Monroe's daughter. He did not ask for you specifically by name, only by description of the family. He is a savage. Rose. He lives in the dirt. Do you think he knows the difference between silk and burlap?" "Mama, we send Clara," Agnes said. The words hung in the air, cold and final. Clara felt like she had been punched in the stomach. She pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. "Clara," Rose sounded confused. "But she is not—" "She is a Monroe," Agnes said dismissively. "She is strong as an ox. She is used to hard work. She is used to sleeping on hard ground and eating whatever scrap is left over. She can survive out there." "You cannot. But will he not know?" Rose asked. He wanted a pretty wife. "Clara is plain, but she is young enough," Agnes said cruelly. "And by the time he realizes she is not the beauty he imagined, the deed will be done. The money will be in my hand. The soldiers will have witnessed the exchange. He will be stuck with her." Agnes's voice became harder, more resolute. "Let him take her. It solves two problems at once. We get the money, and we are rid of another mouth to feed. She has been a burden since your father died, always watching me with those judging eyes. It feels wrong," Rose whispered, though her objection was weak. "Survival is not about right or wrong. Rose," Agnes snapped. "It is about doing what is necessary. He will not know the difference. One white woman is the same as another to him. Now go to bed. Tomorrow, we will pack her things." Clara stood in the darkness as the footsteps retreated up the stairs. The letter was still crumpled in her hand. He will not know the difference. The cruelty of it cut deeper than any whip. To Agnes, Clara was interchangeable, disposable, a counterfeit coin to be passed off to a fool. Agnes was willing to send her into what she believed was a death sentence, or a life of slavery, without a second thought, just to save her precious Rose. Tears pricked Clara's eyes, hot and angry. She looked down at the letter again. "I promise she will not be a servant. The savage promised what her own family denied her." Fear coiled in her belly cold. Slithering fear of the unknown, of the stories of scalpings and raids. But beneath the fear, a fire was kindling. It was the fire of indignation. The fire of a woman who has been told for the last time that she is nothing. She would go, not because Agnes ordered it, not to save Rose. She would go because there was nothing left for her in Red Hollow but dust and scorn. She would go to this Dakota lone hawk. She would walk into the camp of the enemy, and if she died, she would die free of this house. But if she lived... Clara looked at the signature again. Dakota. She folded the letter and tucked it deep into the pocket of her nightdress, next to her heart. She stepped out of the shadows, her jaw set. The girl who had hidden in the corner was gone. Tomorrow, a bride would ride out to meet the warrior. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the window panes, sounding like a chorus of ghosts crying out for the things that were lost, and the things that were yet to be found. The sun would rise tomorrow on a day of betrayal, but Clara Monroe would meet it standing up. The morning sun was blinding when Agnes shook Clara awake. There was no pretense of kindness now. The older woman's face was set in stone. "Get up," Agnes commanded. "Put on your Sunday dress, the blue one. It is too tight on Rose anyway." Clara rose without a word. She did not ask why. She did not feign surprise. She moved with a mechanical precision that seemed to unsettle Agnes. She washed. She dressed in the blue calico gown that pinched at her waist and was too short in the sleeves. She braided her dark hair tight against her head. When she came down to the kitchen, Rose was sitting at the table, weeping into her hands. She could not look at Clara. Agnes shoved a small carpet bag into Clara's hands. "There are a few things in there. And this..." She pressed a handkerchief into Clara's palm. It was one Rose had embroidered, in the corner, in delicate script. It read, "Rose Monroe." "You are Rose now?" Agnes hissed, gripping Clara's arm. Her fingernails dug into the flesh. "Do you understand if you tell him who you are? If you ruin this for us, I will turn you out. If he sends you back, the door will be locked. You will be dead to this family." Clara looked down at the hand gripping her arm. Then she looked up into Agnes's eyes. Her gaze was steady, dry, and terrifyingly calm. "I understand," Clara said. Her voice was unrecognizable to her own ears. It was the voice of a stranger. "Good," Agnes said, releasing her. She seemed relieved, but also slightly unnerved by Clara's lack of fight. "The stagecoach is waiting. It will take you to the rendezvous point. Major Briggs has arranged for a wagon from there." Clara walked out onto the porch. The heat was already rising, shimmering off the hard-packed earth. The stagecoach stood at the gate, the horses stamping impatiently. The driver, a man with a tobacco-stained beard, spat on the ground as she approached. "This the bride?" he asked, leering at her. "Don't look like much of a prize for a chief, but I guess beggars can't be choosers, eh?" Clara ignored him. She climbed into the coach. Inside, 2 other passengers sat a salesman in a dusty suit and a preacher with a Bible on his lap. They stared at her. The town knew. Everyone knew. Clara Monroe was being sent to the savages. Agnes stood on the porch, her arm around a sobbing Rose. They looked like a portrait of grief, but Clara knew better. It was a portrait of relief. The driver cracked his whip. "Yeah!" The coach lurched forward. Clara did not look back. She sat rigid, her hand clutching the handkerchief with her sister's name, and the letter in her pocket. The wheels kicked up a cloud of red dust, obscuring the house, the town, and the life she was leaving behind. She was alone. She was a liar. And she was riding straight into the heart of the wilderness. As the town of Red Hollow faded into the distance, the vast, open emptiness of the prairie swallowed them. The sky was a brutal, endless blue. Clara closed her eyes and let the rhythm of the wheels settle into her bones. She was terrified. Yes, her heart beat like a trapped bird, but for the first time in 22 years, the road ahead was hers. It led to a man named Dakota, and to a destiny that God or perhaps the devil had written for her. The stagecoach rattled over the uneven ground, every jolt sending a fresh wave of pain up Clara Monroe's spine. The air inside the small cabin was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco, and the pervasive, choking dust of the Texas plains. It had been hours since they left the relative safety of Red Hollow. and the landscape had shifted from the scrubby, familiar ranch lands to something wilder and more desolate. This was the edge of the world, or at least the edge of the world as the white settlers knew it. Clara sat squeezed into the corner of the bench seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She wore the blue dress that belonged to Rose. The fabric was of a finer weave than anything Clara had ever owned, but it fit her poorly. It was tight across her shoulders, restricting her movement. The lace at the collar scratched at her neck like a persistent insect every time she breathed. The stays of the corset dug into her ribs, a physical reminder of the lie she was now forced to live. Across from her, the salesman, a man with a face that seemed to be melting in the heat, wiped his forehead with a grimy handkerchief. Next to him sat the preacher, whose Bible lay closed on his knees like a weapon at rest. But it was the conversation drifting down from the driver's seat outside that made Clara's stomach turn. The driver, a man named Silas, who was known for his love of whiskey and his hatred of anything that wasn't white and male, was shouting to the guard riding shotgun. "I give her a week," Silas roared over the noise of the wheels. "Maybe 2 if she knows how to keep her mouth shut. Those Comanches do not have much patience for a delicate flower." The guard laughed. A harsh, barking sound. "You reckon the chief knows what he is getting? They say Lone Hawk has eyes in the back of his head, but he must be blind to trade protection for a white woman. Maybe he plans to trade her back once he tires of her. Or maybe he plans to scalp her and use that pretty hair for a bridle." Silas guffawed. "It is a waste, I tell you. Sending a decent Christian woman to lay with a savage, even if the Monroes are desperate. There are better ways to get money than selling your own blood to the devil." Clara stared out the window at the passing sagebrush. Her face burned with humiliation. They spoke as if she were not there, or as if she were already dead. To them, she was not a person. She was a tragic anecdote, a cautionary tale to be told in saloons over cheap beer. She slipped her hand into the hidden pocket of her skirt. Her fingers brushed against the folded paper of Dakota's letter. The texture of the paper was the only thing that kept her from screaming. She traced the sharp crease of the fold, anchoring herself to the words she had memorized. "I do not buy a person. I need a companion." The men outside saw a monster. They saw a bloodthirsty warrior who wanted a trophy. But the man who wrote those words sought something else. He sought a mother for his child. He sought someone to share the burden of a hard winter. It was a slender thread of hope, barely a spider web. But Clara clung to it with the desperation of a drowning woman. She had to believe the letter. If the letter was a lie, then her life was truly over. The salesman cleared his throat, drawing Clara's attention. He looked at her with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. "Is it true, miss?" he asked, his voice oily. "Are you going voluntarily to the hostels?" Clara turned her gaze to him. Her eyes, usually soft, were hard as flint. "I am going to a husband," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. "And a home," the preacher sniffed disdainfully. "A home among heathens is no home at all. You are walking into the valley of the shadow of death. Child, I shall pray for your soul, for your body is surely forfeit." Clara did not answer. She turned back to the window. The horizon was a flat, shimmering line of heat haze. The sun beat down on the roof of the coach, turning the interior into an oven. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine Rose sitting here. Rose would be fainting by now. Rose would be begging the driver to turn back. Agnes had been right about one thing. Rose would not survive a day in this heat, let alone a life on the high plains. But Clara was made of sterner stuff. She was made of the same dust and grit as the land outside. The coach crested a low rise and began to descend into a shallow basin. The horses picked up speed, sensing the flat ground. Suddenly, a crack like a whip snap tore through the air, louder than the rumble of the wheels. The coach lurched violently to the left. The horses screamed. Clara was thrown against the salesman, her shoulders slamming into his chest. Another shot rang out, and then the shouting started. Pull up, or we will put a hole in your head." The coach ground to a halt. the sudden stop nearly throwing Clara to the floor. Dust billowed up around the windows, choking out the light. The door was wrenched open, and the barrel of a Winchester rifle was thrust inside. "Everyone out," a rough voice commanded. "Hands where I can see them. And be quick about it." Clara scrambled out, her legs shaking. The heat outside was oppressive, hitting her like a physical blow. She stood in the dirt alongside the salesman and the preacher. The driver and the guard were already on the ground, their hands raised, looking pale and terrified. Surrounding the coach were 6 men on horseback. They were not Comanches. They were white men, their clothes stained with grease and road dust, their faces obscured by handkerchiefs. They looked like the land itself had chewed them up and spat them out. "Where's the strongbox?" the leader demanded. He was a large man with a dirty hat pulled low over his eyes. He sat casually on a roan gelding, his rifle resting on his thigh. "There is no strongbox," Silas stammered. "This is just a passenger run. No payroll today." "You are lying," the leader spat. He gestured to one of his men. "Check the boot." 2 of the bandits dismounted and began tearing through the luggage strapped to the back of the coach. They threw trunks and bags onto the ground, smashing locks with the butts of their pistols. Clothes and personal items spilled out into the red dirt, Agnes's old shawls, the salesman's sample cases of patent medicine, the preacher's spare Bible. "Nothing, boss," one of the men yelled. "Just rags and tonic water," the leader cursed, a long stream of profanity that made the preacher wince. He turned his gaze back to the passengers, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Clara. "Well now," the leader drawled, swinging his leg over his saddle and dropping to the ground. He walked toward her, his spurs jingling softly. No gold, but maybe the trip was not a total waste. Clara took a step back, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She kept her chin high, refusing to look away, though every instinct screamed at her to run. "Leave her be," the preacher said, his voice trembling. She is promised." The bandit laughed. "Promised to whom, God?" "To the Comanche," Silas blurted out, eager to shift the focus away from himself. "She is the bride for Lone Hawk, part of the treaty." The bandit leader stopped. He looked from Silas to Clara, a slow, cruel grin spreading beneath his mask. He reached up and pulled the fabric down, revealing a face scarred by smallpox and a mouth full of rotting teeth. "Is that a fact?" he murmured. He stepped closer to Clara, invading her space. He smelled of sour whiskey and unwashed skin. "You are an Indian lover, the white squaw." Clara said nothing. She gripped the folds of her dress, her knuckles white. "You look too clean for a savage," the man said, reaching out to touch a lock of hair that had escaped her braid. Clara jerked her head away. The man's grin widened. "Feisty. I like that. You know, darlin', you are going to have a hard life. Maybe you should show some appreciation to your own kind before you go living in a teepee." "Do not touch me," Clara said. Her voice was low, but it did not waver. "Or what?" the man sneered. He grabbed her wrist, his grip bruising. "Your buck is not here to save you, and neither is the cavalry. It is just us, little lady, and I reckon you owe us a toll for passing through." He yanked her toward him. Clara struggled, digging her heels into the dirt, but he was far stronger. The other bandits laughed, jeering and catcalling. The salesman looked away. The preacher closed his eyes and began to mutter a prayer. No one moved to help her. "Let go of me!" Clara screamed, swinging her free hand to strike him. He caught her other wrist easily, pinning her arms. "You have got fire. I bet the chief would like that. Shame he is never going to see it." Clara squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself for the worst. The despair was a cold weight in her stomach. She had left one hell only to walk straight into another. Then, the ground trembled. It was not a sound at first, but a vibration that traveled up through the soles of Clara's boots. Then came the sound, a low, rhythmic drumming that grew louder with every second. The bandit leader froze. He looked up, his eyes widening. On the ridge to the west, a silhouette appeared against the blinding sun. A single rider on a horse, and then another, and another, until a line of mounted figures stretched across the horizon. They did not shout. They did not scream. War cries. They simply descended. They moved like water pouring down a canyon wall, fluid, unstoppable, and terrifyingly fast. They rode without saddles, their bodies moving in perfect unison with their horses. Feathers tied into the manes of their mounts snapped in the wind. "Comanche!" one of the bandits screamed. The grip on Clara's wrists vanished as the leader shoved her aside, scrambling for his rifle. But it was too late. An arrow hissed through the air and thudded into the dirt inches from the leader's boot. It was not a miss. It was a warning. The bandits scrambled for their horses, panic shattering their bravado. Their mounts, spooked by the oncoming charge, reared and bucked. The Comanche riders encircled the stagecoach in seconds. They did not slow down, riding in a tight, swirling vortex that kicked up a wall of red dust. Clara fell to her knees, covering her head, coughing as the world dissolved into chaos. She heard the sharp crack of rifle fire, but it was directed at the sky or the ground, herding the bandits like cattle. Within moments, the bandits were disarmed. They were pulled from their saddles and thrown into the dirt, their weapons gathered up by the silent, efficient warriors. The swirling dust began to settle. The circle of riders slowed and then stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise of the attack. Clara slowly lowered her arms. She looked up. Surrounding them were a dozen warriors. Their faces were painted with stripes of ochre and black. They held bows and rifles with casual competence. Their eyes were hard, unreadable, fixed on the cowering white men. One rider separated himself from the group. He rode a massive black stallion that stamped the ground impatiently. The man was tall, his chest broad and bare, but for a vest of intricately beaded leather. His hair was long, black as a raven's wing, braided with strips of red cloth. A jagged white scar ran from his left temple down across his cheekbone, disappearing into the strong line of his jaw. He did not look at the bandits. He did not look at the driver. His dark eyes, sharp as a hawk's, locked directly onto Clara. He nudged his horse forward. The animal moved with a terrifying grace, stepping over a discarded rifle without breaking stride. He stopped 5 feet from where Clara knelt in the dust. Clara looked up at him, her breath caught in her throat. This was him. The monster, the bloody warrior. But he did not look like a monster. He looked regal. His face was stern, composed, possessing a fierce dignity that made the white men in the dirt look like sobbing children. He swung his leg over the horse and dropped to the ground. He moved silently, his moccasins making no sound on the earth. He towered over her. Clara braced herself. She expected rough hands. She expected guttural commands she could not understand. The warrior looked down at her. He tilted his head slightly, studying her face. "You do not hide your fear well," he said. His voice was deep, resonant, and shocking in its clarity. He spoke English better than the stagecoach driver. The accent was there, a cadence that spoke of a different mother tongue. But the words were precise. Clara blinked, too stunned to speak. "Stand up," he said. It was not a barked order, but it was not a request either. Clara scrambled to her feet, dusting off her skirt with trembling hands. She felt small before him. He smelled of wood smoke, leather, and something wild and clean, like the wind before a storm. "I am Dakota," he said, his gaze never leaving hers. "I was told I would be meeting Rose Monroe." The world seemed to stop spinning. This was it, the moment of truth. The letter in her pocket felt heavy as lead. Clara looked at the scar on his face. She looked at the intelligence in his eyes. He was not a fool. Agnes had said he would not know the difference, that one white woman was the same as another. But looking at him now, Clara knew that was a lie. This man saw everything. If she told him the truth that she was Clara, the unwanted sister, the substitute, he might leave her here. He might send her back to Agnes, to a life of servitude and scorn. Or worse, he might kill her for the insult. But if she lied, she swallowed hard. Her throat felt like it was full of sand. She straightened her spine, forcing herself to meet his gaze. She channeled every ounce of Rose's entitlement, every ounce of Agnes's cold resolve. "I am Rose," she said. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. It hung in the air between them, fragile and dangerous. Dakota stared at her. His eyes searched her face, lingering on the worry lines around her mouth, the roughness of her hands that were currently clenched in the folds of her skirt. He did not look like a man who was easily deceived. He looked like a man who was measuring the weight of her soul. For a long, agonizing moment, he said nothing. The wind whistled through the sagebrush. "Rose," he repeated slowly, testing the name. He did not smile. He did not nod. He simply accepted the word, though his eyes remained skeptical. He turned to the stagecoach driver, who was trembling on the ground. "Go," Dakota said. "Take your wagon. Take these thieves with you. Tell the soldiers at the fort that Dakota keeps his word. The road is safe." Yes, sir," Silas stammered, scrambling to his feet. Dakota turned back to Clara. "You will ride with me." "Ride?" Clara glanced at the black stallion. It was enormous. I have a trunk. My things." "My men will bring your things," Dakota said. He stepped closer to her. Before she could protest, he placed his hands on her waist. His touch was firm, warm, and electric. Clara gasped as he lifted her effortlessly, as if she weighed no more than a child. He set her onto the horse's withers, just in front of where he would sit. He swung himself up behind her in one fluid motion. Suddenly, she was surrounded by him. His chest was a solid wall against her back, his arms, corded with muscle, reached around her to grasp the reins. He was not holding her, yet she was completely enclosed in his embrace. The proximity was overwhelming. She could feel the heat of his skin through the thin fabric of her dress. She could feel the steady beat of his heart against her shoulder blades. It was a dangerous intimacy, more terrifying and more thrilling than anything she had ever experienced. "Hold the mane," he murmured near her ear. His breath stirred the stray hairs on her neck, sending a shiver down her spine. Clara gripped the horse's coarse black mane. "Where are we going?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Home," Dakota said. He clicked his tongue, and the stallion surged forward. They left the stagecoach and the road behind. Turning south into the deep prairie, the other warriors fell in around them, a silent escort. As they rode, the landscape began to change. The flat, dusty plains gave way to rolling hills covered in tall, golden grass that rippled like the sea. They crossed crystal-clear streams where the water ran cold over smooth stones. The air here was sweeter, untouched by the dust of the wagon wheels. Clara sat rigid at first, terrified of leaning back against him. But as the miles passed, her exhaustion began to outweigh her propriety. Her muscles ached. Slowly, tentatively, she allowed herself to relax. Her back touched his chest. He did not pull away. Instead, she felt his arm tighten slightly around her waist, a subtle adjustment to steady her as the horse navigated a steep incline. It was evening when they reached the camp. Clara had expected squalor. She had expected chaos, but as they crested the final ridge, the valley below took her breath away. Dozens of teepees were arranged in a great circle along the bend of a wide river. They glowed warm and inviting in the twilight, lit by the fires burning within. Smoke curled lazily into the purple sky. Children were running through the grass, their laughter drifting up on the wind. Women were gathered near the fires, their voices low and melodic. A vast herd of horses grazed peacefully on the far bank. It was a scene of profound order and beauty. It was a community. Dakota slowed the stallion to a walk. "This is the place of the people," he said quietly. Clara looked down at the village. She felt the lie of her name sitting heavy in her chest, a stone that threatened to drag her down. She was an imposter in this beautiful, strange world. She was Clara, the unwanted one, pretending to be the prize. But as Dakota guided the horse down the path toward the waiting fires, Clara felt a strange sensation. For the first time in her life, she was not walking behind. She was not the shadow in the corner. She was riding at the front, held securely by the arms of a warrior who had looked at her fear and told her to stand up. She was afraid, yes, but as they crossed the threshold into the camp, Clara Monroe realized she had never felt more alive. The village of the Comanche was a world unto itself, a circle of order amidst the sprawling chaos of the plains. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and charcoal, Dakota guided his stallion through the perimeter of the camp. The arrival of the war chief was usually a cause for celebration, a time for drums and songs of victory. But today the reception was muted. Silence rippled through the gathered crowd like a stone dropped in a pond. Men paused in their sharpening of arrowheads. Women looked up from their fires, their hands stilling over half-ground corn. They watched Dakota, their protector, and then their dark, impenetrable gazes shifted to the woman sitting before him on the great black horse. Clara felt their eyes on her skin like physical touches. She sat rigid within the circle of Dakota's arms, her knuckles white where she gripped the horse's mane. To them, she was not Clara Monroe, the hard-working ranch girl. She was not even Rose, the beauty promised in a treaty. She was simply a symbol. She was the enemy made flesh, a bargaining chip brought into their sanctuary to buy a winter of peace. She felt the tension in Dakota's chest against her back. He did not shrink from the scrutiny of his people. He sat taller, his chin raised, challenging anyone to question his decision. "Be easy," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that only she could hear. "They look only to see if you have courage." Clara swallowed the lump of fear in her throat. "And if I do not, then you must pretend," he said, "until the pretending becomes the truth." He brought the stallion to a halt before a lodge that stood slightly apart from the others. It was larger than the surrounding teepees, its buffalo hide covering painted with geometric shapes and the running figures of horses in red and black pigment. Dakota slid from the back of the horse and reached up, his hands spanning her waist to lift her down. For a moment, as her feet touched the earth, she was standing within the circle of his arms again. The smell of him, wood smoke, leather, and the musk of the horse filled her senses. He looked down at her, his face unreadable in the twilight, before stepping back to open the flap of the lodge. "Enter," he said. "This is your home now." Clara stepped inside. The interior was surprisingly spacious and warm. A small fire burned in the center pit, sending a thin stream of smoke up through the vent at the peak. The floor was layered with thick furs that softened the ground. But what struck Clara most was the lingering presence of the woman who had come before her. On one side of the lodge, neatly arranged, were the belongings of a life interrupted. There was a wooden bowl polished smooth by use, a digging stick, and a beaded necklace hanging from a lodge pole. A blanket, embroidered with an intricate design of a galloping pony, lay folded on a raised platform. The air smelled of sage and sweetgrass, but beneath it was a faint, floral scent, dried lavender. Perhaps that felt like a ghost. Clara felt a sudden, crushing wave of guilt. She was an imposter in every sense. She had stolen her sister's name, and now she was stepping into the footprint of a dead woman, occupying a space that had been carved out by love and loss. A rustling sound from the back of the lodge made her jump. Peering out from behind a stack of buffalo robes was a child. She looked to be no more than 5 or 6 years old. Her hair was black as midnight, braided into 2 long plaits that fell over her shoulders. Her eyes were enormous, dark and luminous, filled with a mixture of terror and intense curiosity. Dakota stepped in behind Clara. The stern warrior's face softened instantly, a transformation so complete it made Clara's breath catch. "Ayanna," he said softly. The little girl did not move toward him immediately. Her gaze was fixed on Clara. She looked at the blue dress, the pale skin, the terrified eyes of the stranger. "She speaks the tongue of your people." "A little," Dakota explained to Clara, keeping his voice low. "Her mother, she insisted the child learn. She spent time at the mission before the soldiers drove us back." The girl took a tentative step forward. Her small hands were clenched in the fabric of her tunic. She looked up at Clara, her bottom lip trembling slightly. "Hello?" the child whispered. The word was clumsy, shaped by a tongue used to different sounds, but it was clear. Clara felt her heart crack wide open. She dropped to her knees, heedless of the dirt on Rose's fine dress, so she could be at eye level with the child. "Hello, Ayanna," Clara said, her voice shaking. I am Rose." The lie tasted like ash, but she forced a smile. Ayanna did not return the smile, but she did not run away. She studied Clara with a solemn intensity, looking for something Clara could not name. That night, the reality of her new life set in with the setting of the sun. The lodge grew dark, illuminated only by the dying embers of the fire. Dakota arranged the sleeping robes. He did not ask her to share his bedding. Instead, he laid out a thick pile of furs on the opposite side of the fire from his own. "You will sleep there," he said. His voice was polite, distant. "You are safe here. No one will enter this lodge without my permission." Clara lay down, pulling the buffalo robe up to her chin. The fur was heavy and warm. Across the fire, she watched Dakota settle himself. He stripped off his vest and shirt, the firelight dancing over the bronze expanse of his back, the muscles shifting like water under skin. He lay down with his back to her, one arm thrown over Ayanna, who curled into his side like a small kitten. I slept for a long time. The ground was hard beneath the furs, but it was not the physical discomfort that kept Clara awake. It was the man breathing steadily across the fire. In the deep silence of the night, she could hear the rhythm of his breath. It synced with the beating of her own heart. She was a stranger in a land that wanted her dead, protected only by the word of a man who thought she was someone else. Over the next 2 weeks, a routine emerged. Fragile as new ice, Clara, who had spent her life laboring on a ranch, was no stranger to hard work. But the work of the Comanche women was a language she had yet to learn. She tried to make herself useful. She watched the other women as they worked near the stream, scraping hides or pounding meat with berries to make pemmican. When she approached them, conversation would die down, replaced by sharp, rapid exchanges in Comanche that Clara could not understand. One woman, older, with gray streaks in her hair and a face weathered like ancient sandstone, watched Clara with particular hawk-like intensity. Her name, Clara learned, was grandmother to one of the younger braves. She would stand with her arms crossed, making clicking sounds with her tongue whenever Clara fumbled with the stretching of a hide or let the fire burn too low. "She thinks you are useless," Dakota said one evening, appearing silently behind Clara as she struggled to skin a rabbit she had been given. Clara jumped, nearly slicing her thumb. "I know how to skin a rabbit," she muttered, frustrated. "I have done it 100 times, but this knife is dull." Dakota knelt beside her. He took the knife from her hand. His fingers brushed hers warm, calloused, sending a jolt of electricity up her arm that made her breath hitch. He did not pull away immediately. He held her gaze, his dark eyes searching hers. "The knife is not dull," he said softly. "The hand holding it is trembling." He sharpened the blade on a stone he carried at his belt, the rhythmic scraping sound filling the quiet air. He handed it back to her. "My people value strength. Show them you are not a flower that wilts in the sun." "I am not a flower," Clara said, finding her voice. "I am a weed. I grow where I am not wanted." A ghost of a smile touched Dakota's lips. It was the first time she had seen it a true smile, not just a polite expression. It changed his face entirely, erasing the severity of the scar and making him look younger, less like a monument to war. "Weeds are resilient," he said. "They hold the earth together when the wind comes." And the wind did come. It happened 3 days later. The morning had dawned with a strange, eerie stillness. The sky turned a sickly shade of greenish yellow, and the birds fell silent. By midday, the horizon had disappeared, swallowed by a wall of churning brown dust that stretched from the earth to the heavens. Sandstorm. The cry went up through the camp. Clara was near the stream with Ayanna. The little girl was showing Clara how to find smooth stones for a game she played. When the first gust hit, it was strong enough to stagger them. The air was instantly filled with grit, a stinging assault that blinded the eyes and clogged the throat. "Ayana!" Clara screamed, the sound torn away by the howling gale. The camp descended into chaos. People were running, shouting, securing the flaps of their lodges. The wind roared like a living thing, tearing at everything it touched. Clara reached for Ayana, but the child had seen something, perhaps a favorite toy left by the water. Or perhaps she was simply disoriented by the sudden violence of the air. Ayana broke away, running toward the edge of the embankment where the stream cut deep into the earth. "No!" Clara lunged forward. The dust was so thick she could barely see 5 feet in front of her. She saw the small figure of the girl stumbling near the drop-off. The wind was pushing her, dragging her small body toward the edge where the jagged rocks of the dry creek bed waited 10 feet below. Clara did not think. She did not calculate. She threw herself forward, her body becoming a shield against the wind. She tackled Ayana just as the girl's foot slipped over the edge. They hit the ground hard. Clara twisted in midair, ensuring her own body took the impact. She slammed into the rocky earth, her back scraping against the stones, her arms locked in a vice grip around the child. A sharp pain seared through Clara's forearm as a jagged rock sliced the skin. But she did not let go. She curled around Ayana, burying the girl's face in her chest, pulling her own skirt up to cover the child's head. "Stay down!" Clara shouted over the roar of the wind. "I have you, I have you!" The storm raged over them, burying them in sand and debris. Clara lay there, her body a human barrier, whispering reassurances she did not feel into the girl's ear. She stayed that way for what felt like hours, though it might have been only minutes, enduring the stinging sand that flayed her exposed skin. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the wind died down. The roaring faded to a whistle, and then to a silence broken only by the coughing of the villagers. Clara slowly raised her head. She was covered in red dust. Her arm was bleeding sluggishly, the blood turning black in the sand. She looked down. Ayana was unhurt, curled in a ball, her eyes wide with shock. A shadow fell over them. Clara looked up to see Dakota standing there. He was breathless, his hair wild, his chest heaving. He had been searching for them. He looked at the edge of the ravine, just inches from Clara's boots. He looked at the blood on Clara's arm, and then he looked at his daughter, safe in the arms of the white woman. The look on his face was one of raw, naked terror that was rapidly bleeding into something else, something fierce and profoundly grateful. He dropped to his knees in the dirt. He did not speak. He simply reached out and placed his large hand on Clara's shoulder, squeezing tight as if to assure himself she was real. That night, the air was crisp and cold. The dust settled by the stillness. Inside the lodge, a fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Clara sat by the fire, wincing slightly as she cleaned the cut on her arm with a damp cloth. It was not deep, but it throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. Ayana sat opposite her. The child had been silent since the storm, watching Clara with an intensity that was almost unnerving. She held a small rag doll in her lap, her fingers working nervously at the yarn hair. Dakota was outside, securing the horses, checking the damage to the other lodges. It was just the two of them. Ayana stood up. She walked slowly around the fire until she stood directly in front of Clara. She reached out a small hand and touched the bandage on Clara's arm. "Does it hurt?" Ayana asked quietly. "Only a little." Clara lied softly. "I am tough, like a weed, remember?" Ayana did not smile. She looked up into Clara's face, her dark eyes swimming with unshed tears. She took a deep, shuddering breath. "I prayed," Ayana whispered. Her English was halting, broken by the emotion in her voice. "For a mama. After my mother died, I asked the spirits. I asked Jesus God at the mission." Clara froze. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. "Ayana." The little girl stepped closer, moving into the space between Clara's knees. She placed her small hands on Clara's cheeks, her palms cool against Clara's flushed skin. "They said you came for the treaty," Ayana said, her voice gaining a surprising, childish certainty. "But that is not true." She looked deep into Clara's eyes, seeing past the blue dress, past the fear, past the lies. "God sent you after all," Ayanna declared. The words hung in the smoky air, simple and devastating. "God sent you after all." It broke Clara, the dam she had built around her heart, constructed of resentment toward Agnes, fear of the Comanche, and the crushing weight of her own imposter syndrome. Shattered. A sob tore from her throat, a harsh, ragged sound. She was not Rose, she was not the beautiful sister. She was Clara, the one nobody wanted, but this child, this motherless child who had almost died today, did not care about names. She cared that someone had caught her. Clara pulled Ayanna into her arms, burying her face in the girl's small shoulder. She wept, hot tears soaking into the child's buckskin tunic. She cried for the lie she was living, and she cried for the sudden, overwhelming love she felt for this little girl who had claimed her. "I am here," Clara sobbed. "I am here, Ayanna." Outside the flap of the lodge, Dakota stood frozen. He had returned from the horses, intending to check on Clara's wound. He stood in the shadows, his hand hovering over the leather opening. He had heard every word. "God sent you after all." His hand dropped to his side. He leaned his forehead against the rough pole of the lodge entrance. His heart was beating a war rhythm in his chest. He felt a surge of gratitude so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. But intertwined with it was a cold, snaking fear. He was a warrior. He knew how to fight soldiers. He knew how to hunt buffalo. But he did not know how to fight the feeling that was taking root in his chest. He had prayed too, in his own way, to the spirits of his ancestors, asking for someone to help him carry the burden of his grief and his daughter's loneliness. He had asked for a contract. He had received a miracle, and miracles were dangerous things to hold. He took a long breath, composing his features, and pushed aside the flap. Inside, the weeping had subsided. Clara sat wiping her eyes, Ayanna still clinging to her side. When Dakota entered, Clara looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and vulnerable. She looked terrified that he would mock her emotions. Dakota moved to the fire. He added a log, the sparks flying up like fireflies. He did not speak of what he had heard. He could not. The words were too heavy. "The night is cold," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "The wind has stripped the warmth from the earth." He moved to his sleeping side, but he did not lie down. He looked at Clara, shivering slightly in her thin dress, the adrenaline of the day fading into a chill that rattled her bones. Without a word, he picked up his heavy buffalo robe. He walked around the fire. Clara stiffened as he approached, her eyes widening. Dakota sat down beside her. He did not touch her improperly. He simply wrapped the great fur robe around her shoulders, encompassing her and Ayanna in a single cocoon of warmth. "Rest," he commanded gently. He stayed there. He sat close enough that his thigh pressed against hers. He sat close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his chest, burning through the layers of fabric between them. Clara leaned back, exhausted, and discovered that she was leaning against him. His arm came up, resting on the robe behind her, effectively holding her upright. It was not a sexual embrace, yet it was the most intimate moment of Clara's life. The steady rise and fall of his breathing against her back was a lullaby. The scent of him filled her head. She closed her eyes, her hand resting on Ayanna's hair, her back supported by the strength of the warrior. In the darkness, the truth whispered to her, louder than the wind. She did not just want to be safe. She did not just want to survive. She wanted him. She wanted this man who covered her with furs and sharpened her knife. And the terrifying realization was that she would do anything, even continue this dangerous lie, to keep this feeling for just one more day. The weeks that followed the storm bled into one another, transforming the rhythm of Clara's life from a chaotic struggle for survival into something resembling a heartbeat. The blue calico dress, stained and torn from her desperate rescue of Ayanna, had been folded away. In its place, she wore a tunic of soft doeskin that hung to her knees and leggings that protected her skin from the tall grass. She no longer looked like the stiff, terrified woman who had stepped off the stagecoach. The sun had darkened her skin to a shade of warm honey, and the wind had loosened the severe braids Agnes had insisted upon, leaving her dark hair to flow more freely around her shoulders. She was learning the land. Dakota did not keep her confined to the camp. He seemed to understand that a bird kept in a cage would eventually lose its song. And so he took her and Ayanna out onto the open prairie. One afternoon, under a sky so blue it hurt to look at, they rode to a high ridge overlooking a vast, rolling valley. Clara rode a spotted mare Dakota had gifted her, a gentle creature that responded to the slightest pressure of her knees. Ayanna rode ahead on her pony, her laughter carrying on the wind, a sound that never failed to make Dakota's stoic face soften. Dakota brought his black stallion up beside Clara. He pointed to the valley floor, where white shapes lay scattered like fallen clouds among the green grass. "Do you see them?" he asked, his voice low. Clara squinted against the glare. As her eyes adjusted, a chill ran down her spine despite the heat. They were not clouds. They were bones, bleached, white ribs curving up from the earth. Thousands of them, stretching as far as she could see. "The buffalo?" Clara whispered. "The life of my people," Dakota corrected. 3 years ago, this valley was black with them. The earth shook when they moved. Now, there is only silence. He looked at her, his dark eyes filled with an ancient, simmering grief. The hunters come. They shoot from the trains. They shoot from the wagons. They take the hide for coats in the east, and they leave the meat to rot. They kill the buffalo to kill the Comanche. Clara felt a wave of nausea. She had heard the men in Red Hollow boast of their kills, of shooting 50 beasts in a morning just for sport. She had never understood what it meant until now. It was not hunting. It was an erasure. "I'm sorry," she said, the words feeling woefully inadequate. "Do not be sorry," Dakota said, turning his horse away from the graveyard of bones. "Be strong. That is what Ayanna needs. That is what this land demands. Sorrow feeds nothing. Strength feeds the future." He was hard. Yes, he was a man carved from the granite of the mountains. But Clara was beginning to see the cracks in the stone where the light shone through. She saw it in the way he patiently untangled Ayanna's fishing line from the reeds. She saw it in the way he ensured Clara had the choicest cut of meat at the evening fire. Though he never said a word of affection, the connection between them was growing, forged in these quiet moments. It was not the courtly romance she had read about in Rose's stolen novels. It was sharper, heavier, and far more dangerous. A few days later, the lesson in strength took a physical form. Dakota decided it was time she learned to use a bow. They stood in a grove of cottonwood trees near the river. The air was thick with the scent of sap and damp earth. Dakota handed her a bow made of ash wood, lighter than his own war bow, but still stiff and unyielding. "The gun runs out of bullets," Dakota said, standing beside her. "The bow breathes with you. It does not jam. It does not rust." Clara took the weapon. It felt awkward in her hands. She tried to imitate the stance she had seen the warriors use, feet planted wide, back straight. She knocked the arrow, hooked her fingers around the string, and pulled. Her arm shook. The string bit into her fingers. The arrow wobbled drunkenly and fell to the ground 3 feet away. "You fight the wood," Dakota said. He moved closer. "You must become part of it." He stepped behind her. Clara's breath hitched. He was so close that the fringe of his buckskin shirt brushed against her shoulder. She could feel the heat radiating from his chest, a solid wall of warmth against her back. "Raise your left arm," he murmured, his voice right at her ear. He reached around her. His left hand covered hers on the grip of the bow, his fingers long and rough, encompassing her smaller hand completely. His right hand moved to cover hers on the string. "Now," he said, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating through her ribs. "Draw back. Use your back muscles, not just your arm." They pulled together. The wood groaned in protest, bending into a perfect arc. Clara could feel the power coiled within the weapon, but she was far more aware of the man controlling it. His chest pressed against her shoulder blades. His cheek was inches from her temple. The scent of him sage, leather, and male skin flooded her senses, drowning out the world. "Breathe," he commanded. Clara tried to inhale, but the air felt thick. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, and she was certain he could feel it. "Focus on the tree," he whispered. His breath ghosted over the sensitive skin of her neck, sending a shiver racing down her spine that had nothing to do with the cool breeze. "See only the mark." His hands adjusted hers, tilting the bow slightly. His thumb brushed the inside of her wrist, a touch so light yet so electrifying that Clara nearly dropped the weapon. It was an intimacy that went beyond skin. It was a shared tension, a shared purpose. For a moment, they were one creature, breathing in unison. "Release," he said. They let the string fly together. The arrow hissed through the air, burying itself deep into the bark of the cottonwood tree with a solid thwack. "Good," Dakota murmured. He did not step away immediately. For 2 heartbeats, he remained there, wrapping her in his presence, his hands lingering over hers. The silence between them was heavy, charged with a static electricity that made the air hum. Clara leaned back, just a fraction of an inch, allowing herself to rest against his strength. Then he stepped back. The loss of his warmth was sudden and cold. "Again," he said, his voice rougher than before. "Until you do not need my hands." Clara turned to look at him. His face was impassive, but his eyes were dark, the pupils blown wide. He looked at her mouth, then quickly up to her eyes, and she knew he felt it too. The pull, the gravity. They practiced until the sun began to dip, but the tension never dissipated. It only coiled tighter, waiting to snap. However, the bubble of their isolation could not last forever. 2 days later, reality intruded with the sound of jingling spurs and the creak of leather saddles. Dakota, Clara, and a small hunting party including Neshoba, a younger cousin of Dakota who wore his distrust of Clara like a badge of honor, were returning from the upper ridges. They were crossing a shallow ford when they saw them. A patrol of 10 cavalry soldiers, accompanied by 3 civilian scouts, blocked the path. At the head of the column rode a man Clara recognized instantly, and her blood turned to ice. Captain Harlan Briggs. He was a man of sharp angles and cold efficiency, the commander from Red Hollow who had facilitated the treaty with Agnes. Dakota signaled for his party to stop. His face hardened into a mask of stone. He rode forward, placing himself between the soldiers and his people. "You are far from the fort, Captain," Dakota said, his English crisp. "This is treaty land." Briggs smiled, but it did not reach his pale eyes. He took a slow drag from a thin cigar and exhaled a plume of smoke. "Just patrolling the boundaries, lone hawk, making sure everyone is obeying the terms." His gaze drifted past Dakota. He scanned the hunting party, dismissing the warriors with a sneer, until his eyes landed on Clara. Clara froze. She was dressed in skins, her hair windblown, her skin tanned, but Briggs knew. Well, Briggs drawled, urging his horse a few steps closer. "If it isn't the blushing bride, you seem to have gone native rather quickly. Miss Monroe, Clara lifted her chin, mimicking Dakota's stoicism. "I am where I belong, Captain," Briggs chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Is that so? You know, I saw your mother, your stepmother, I should say just last week. She seemed quite anxious about you, or perhaps she was anxious about the money. Hard to tell with Agnes." He looked at her with a knowing glint in his eye. It was a look of a predator toying with a mouse. "Tell me," Briggs said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial volume that carried perfectly in the silence. "How is the little sister doing, Rose? Isn't it? Or was it Clara? I always get the two of you confused. One the beauty, one the worker. It must be hard to remember which role you are playing." The world stopped. Clara's hands clenched on her reins. He knew, or at least he suspected enough to use it as a weapon. "My name is Rose," Clara said, forcing the lie through lips that felt numb. "And I am the wife of Dakota." Briggs studied her for a long moment, then shrugged. "If you say so, just remember, the treaty is specific. It guarantees protection for a specific alliance. If the terms of that alliance were found to be fraudulent, well, the army might not feel so obligated to keep the settlers off this hunting ground. He turned his horse. Good day, Lone Hawk. Give my regards to the little lady. The soldiers rode past, the dust from their horses choking the air. Dakota watched them go, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. When they were gone, he turned to look at Clara. His expression was searching, troubled. He had heard the exchange. He had heard the emphasis Briggs placed on the names. But before he could speak, Nashoba rode up beside him, speaking rapidly in Comanche. Clara did not need to know the words to understand the tone. It was venomous. Nashoba gestured at Clara, then at the retreating soldiers. Spitting on the ground, "He says you bring the wolves to our door." Dakota translated quietly, not looking at Nashoba. "I did nothing," Clara whispered. "You exist," Nashoba said in broken English, glaring at her. "White women are poisonous, soft. She will break, and we will bleed." Dakota silenced him with a sharp gesture. "Enough. She rides with us." But the damage was done. The ride back to camp was shrouded in a heavy silence. Clara could feel Nashoba's eyes boring into her back. She felt the weight of the lie crushing her. "It isn't the mama God sent," Ayanna had said, but to the rest of the world, names mattered, papers mattered, and Clara was a fraud who could bring down an entire nation. That night, the atmosphere in the village was tense. The encounter with the soldiers had stirred up old angers. Drums beat low and rhythmic near the council fire. But inside Dakota's lodge, it was quiet. Ayanna was asleep on her furs, clutching the rag doll Clara had repaired for her. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting deep shadows across the buffalo hides. Clara sat hugging her knees, staring into the red coals. Dakota sat opposite her, mending a bridle. The rhythmic scrape of his awl against the leather was the only sound. "Briggs is a snake," Dakota said suddenly, breaking the silence. He did not look up from his work. "He looks for cracks in the stone so he can insert his pry bar." Clara swallowed hard. "He hates you. He hates all of this. He hates that we are free," Dakota said. He set the bridle down and looked across the fire at her. What did he mean? Clara. About the names. Clara's heart skipped a beat. It was the first time he had used the name Clara since the night of the storm. The night Ayanna had exposed her. Since then, they had lived in a silent agreement not to speak of it. He likes to play games," Clara stammered. "He tries to make me feel small, to remind me that I was the other sister, the one not meant for this." Dakota stood up. He moved around the fire with the silent grace of a mountain lion. He stopped in front of her. Clara looked up, her breath catching. He was so tall, so imposing in the dim light. He knelt down, bringing his face level with hers. He reached out and took her hand. He turned it over, tracing the faint white line of the scar on her forearm, the mark she had earned saving his daughter. "This is not a game," Dakota said softly. His thumb rubbed over the scar tissue, sending shivers racing up her arm. "This is blood. This is life. You bled for my child. You walk my path." Briggs sees a name on a paper. "I see the woman who sits before me." "I am afraid," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "I am afraid that I will ruin everything for you. Nashoba is right. I am a weakness." "Look at me," Dakota commanded. Clara raised her gaze to his. His eyes were endless, dark pools of firelight and intensity. "You are not a weakness," he said fiercely. "You are the strongest thing in this valley. You carry a burden that would break a warrior, and you do it with silence." He leaned closer. The air between them seemed to evaporate. "I owe you a life, Clara, but when I look at you, I do not feel debt." "What do you feel?" she breathed. Dakota did not answer with words. He reached up, his hand cupping her cheek. His skin was rough, calloused from war and work, but his touch was incredibly gentle. He tilted her head back. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not the polite peck of a courtship. It was a collision. It was the taste of smoke and desire and weeks of suppressed longing. His lips were firm, demanding, and hot. Clara gasped, her hands instinctively clutching his shoulders, pulling him closer. Dakota groaned low in his throat. He shifted, one hand sliding down her back, pulling her flush against him. Through the thin layers of deerskin and cotton, she could feel the hard muscles of his chest, the heavy thud of his heart. Clara opened to him, meeting his intensity. For the first time in her life, she was not the invisible girl. She was the center of the world. She was wanted. The kiss deepened, becoming a desperate, hungry thing. Dakota's hand tangled in her hair, angling her head to access her mouth more fully. His other hand swept down the curve of her spine, resting on her hip, his thumb pressing into the soft flesh. It was dangerous. It was intoxicating. It was everything she had been warned against. It was the only thing that made sense. "Dakota," she whispered against his lips, a plea and a prayer. He pulled back just an inch, his forehead resting against hers, their breath mingling in harsh gasps. His eyes were blown wide, dark with intent. He looked ready to lay her down on the furs, to claim her completely, and Clara knew she would let him. She wanted him to, "Mama." The small, sleepy voice cut through the heated air like a knife. Dakota and Clara froze. They sprang apart as if burned. Ayanna was sitting up in her furs, rubbing her eyes. She looked confused, blinking in the firelight. "I had a bad dream. The wind came back." Dakota took a shuddering breath, running a hand over his face to wipe away the desire that must have been written there plainly. He turned to his daughter, his voice raspy. "There is no wind, little bird," he said. "Sleep. I am here. Rose is here." He used a false name. The reminder hit Clara like a physical blow. Ayanna lay back down, comforted, and was asleep within moments. But the spell was broken. The fire in the lodge still burned, but the shadow of the outside world had returned. Dakota looked at Clara. The heat was still in his eyes, but it was tempered now by a stark realization. He had crossed a line. He had fallen for the woman who was not his wife on paper. In doing so, he had placed his heart in the hands of a dangerous secret. "Sleep," he said to Clara, his voice tight. "We will speak in the morning." But the morning brought no peace. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when the sound of hoofbeats thundered through the camp. A scout, one of the men Dakota had posted near the fort, rode in on a lathered horse. He slid to the ground and ran to Dakota's lodge. Dakota emerged, shirtless, his rifle in hand. Clara stood in the doorway, clutching a blanket around her shoulders. The scout spoke rapidly in Comanche, pointing back toward the town. Dakota's face went ashen. He listened, his jaw tightening until the muscle jumped. He turned to Clara. "What is it?" she asked, fear gripping her throat. "Briggs," Dakota said. The name was a curse. "He has sent a message to the Indian agent. He claims the treaty is void." "Void? Why?" "He says the marriage was never registered," Dakota said, his eyes locking onto hers. "He says the woman in my camp is a fraud, an imposter. He demands the army nullify the protection order and open the land to the cattlemen immediately." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. It was happening. Agnes's greed and Briggs's cruelty had combined into a trap. "He is coming," Dakota continued, his voice grim. "He demands a council. He wants you to stand before the elders and the agents and prove who you are." Dakota stepped closer to her. "If you are Rose, we have a treaty. If you are Clara, we have nothing, and my people will pay the price." The bomb had exploded. The secret was no longer just a burden on Clara's heart. It was a weapon pointed at the throat of the entire Comanche nation, and Clara knew, with a sickening certainty, that she was the one holding the trigger. The dust plume heralded their arrival long before the sound of hoofbeats reached the camp. It was a thick, choking cloud that rose against the midday sun, signaling a column of riders moving with purpose. In the Comanche camp, the rhythm of daily life fractured instantly. Women gathered their children, moving them toward the rear of the lodges. Warriors reached for their rifles and strung their bows, their faces hardening into masks of war. Dakota stood at the center of the circle, his arms crossed over his chest. He wore his full regalia today, the eagle feathers in his hair stirring in the hot breeze, a testament to his rank and his resolve. Clara stood just behind him, her hand resting on Ayana's shoulder. The little girl pressed close to Clara's leg, sensing the shift in the air, the sudden, sharp scent of danger. Clara felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She knew, with a terrifying certainty, that the time of borrowed happiness was over. The column rode into the village without asking permission. At the head was Captain Harlan Briggs, his blue uniform pristine despite the heat, his saber rattling against his saddle. Behind him rode 20 cavalrymen, their carbines resting on their thighs. But it was the wagon rumbling in the center of the formation that made Clara's breath stop in her throat. Briggs raised a gloved hand, halting the column. He looked down at Dakota from his high horse, a smirk playing on his thin lips. "Lone Hawk," Briggs greeted, his voice dripping with false civility. "I trust the winter supplies have been adequate." "We did not ask for you to come here, Captain," Dakota said, his voice like granite. "The treaty says the soldiers stay past the river." "The treaty," Briggs repeated, chuckling softly. "Yes, well, that is exactly why I'm here. We have a small administrative matter to clear up regarding the terms of our agreement." He gestured to the wagon. A soldier jumped down and opened the door. 2 women stepped out. First came Agnes, looking severe and terrified in equal measure, clutching her reticule as if it contained the last of her soul. And then came Rose. She wore a pale blue traveling dress with lace at the throat, her blonde hair pinned up under a bonnet. She looked fragile, beautiful, and completely out of place against the backdrop of buffalo hide lodges and drying meat. A ripple of confusion went through the gathered Comanche elders. They looked from the pale woman in the blue dress to the sun-browned woman in deerskin standing behind their chief. Briggs dismounted, dusting off his trousers. He walked to the center of the clearing, standing between the 2 groups. "Elders of the Comanche," Briggs announced, his voice booming so the interpreter could translate. "I come to you today because a grave injustice has been done. A fraud has been committed against the United States government and against your people." He turned and pointed a finger directly at Clara. "That woman," Briggs declared, "is not Rose Monroe." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "This," Briggs continued, gesturing to the trembling girl by the wagon, "is Rose Monroe, the woman promised in the treaty, the woman whose name is on the papers signed by the Indian agent." Dakota did not move. He did not look at Briggs. He turned slowly, his body pivoting with the weight of a closing heavy door, to face Clara. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were dark, searching for a denial she could not give. "Tell them," Briggs commanded Agnes. Agnes stepped forward. She refused to look at Clara. Her eyes were fixed on the ground, but her voice was shrill, propelled by desperation. "It is true," Agnes said. "That is Clara, my stepdaughter. She was always jealous of Rose, jealous of her beauty, jealous of her prospects." Agnes took a breath, and then the lie came spilling out, poisonous and vile. When the letter came, Clara stole it. She forced her sister into silence. She said she wanted the horses. She said she wanted the wealth of the Comanche chief, that she would go and live like a queen while we starved. She stole Rose's name and ran away before we could stop her. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. It was a monstrous lie. Agnes was painting her as a greedy opportunist, twisting the tragedy of her sacrifice into a sin of avarice. "No," Clara whispered, the word barely audible. "Speak up," Briggs barked. He turned to Rose. "And you, Miss Monroe, tell the chief who you are." Rose looked up. Her eyes were swimming with tears. She looked at Clara, her sister, who had gone into the wilderness to save her, and then she looked at Agnes, who was gripping her arm hard enough to leave bruises. Fear won out over loyalty. "I am Rose Monroe," she sobbed, her voice trembling. "I am the one he asked for." The murmurs began among the Comanche. Elders leaned in, whispering to one another. Women who had worked beside Clara. who had watched her scrape hides and carry water, looked at her now with narrowing eyes. Betrayal is a bitter taste, and it spreads quickly. Briggs seized the moment. "You see," he shouted, spreading his arms wide, "you have been harboring a liar, a fraud. This woman has no legal standing. Marriage is a sham. The treaty is built on a lie." Neshoba stepped forward from the circle of warriors. His face was twisted in fury. He had never trusted the white woman, and now his hatred was vindicated. "She is a poison!" Neshoba shouted in Comanche, then switched to broken English so Clara could understand. "I told you White Tongue is split. She comes to steal. She comes to mock us." He pointed his rifle at Clara. Dakota knocked the barrel aside with a swift, violent motion of his hand, but he did not step between them as he usually did. Dakota looked at Clara. The distance between them, usually bridged by their shared breath and silent understanding, now felt like a canyon. "Is it true?" Dakota asked. His voice was not angry. It was quiet, and that terrified Clara more than if he had screamed. "Do not lie to me now. What is your name?" Clara looked at him. She looked at the scar on his cheek, the strong hands that had taught her to hold a bow, the eyes that had looked at her with heat and longing just nights ago. She looked down at Ayanna, who was gripping her hand so tightly her knuckles were white. She could not lie anymore. The truth was the only thing she had left. "My name is Clara," she said clearly, her voice ringing out in the stillness. "I am Clara Monroe." A collective gasp went through the crowd. "But I did not come for greed," Clara continued, desperation rising in her chest. "I came because they would not send Rose. I came because I thought I could be enough. I did not steal anything. I gave everything." "Enough," Briggs cut in, stepping forward to block Dakota's view of her. "It does not matter why she came. The fact is, she is not the woman in the contract. The treaty specifies Rose Monroe. If Rose Monroe is not the bride, there is no treaty. The protection is null and void." He turned his cold smile on the elders. "You have been protecting a runaway spinster. The United States Army is not in the habit of honoring agreements made with phantoms." The elders began to argue loudly. The fragile peace was shattering before their eyes. Neshoba was shouting that the woman must be expelled, that her presence was a curse that would bring ruin upon them all. He demanded she be thrown out to cleanse the camp. Dakota stood in the center of the storm. He looked at the chaos around him. He looked at Briggs, who was watching with the satisfaction of a man who had just won a high-stakes game. And then he looked back at Clara. He looked at the woman who had saved his daughter from the sandstorm, the woman who had bled for them, the woman he had kissed by the firelight. But he also saw the lie. He saw the deception that had been the foundation of every moment they had shared. He was a man of honor, a man whose word was iron. To him, a lie was not just a mistake. It was a rot that ate away at the soul of a thing. "Dakota," Clara whispered, stepping toward him. "Please, you know me. You know who I am. In here." She pressed her hand to her heart. Dakota looked at her hand, then he looked up into her eyes. The pain in his gaze was raw, open, and devastating. "I do not know you," Dakota said, his voice raspy with emotion. "I know a woman named Rose. I respected a woman named Rose. I cared for a woman named Rose." He took a slow breath, his chest heaving. "I do not know who I have loved, Clara, or the Rose promised on paper. The woman I held was a shadow, a reflection in the water." The words struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. She staggered back, her breath leaving her in a rush. He was not just rejecting the lie, he was rejecting the reality of their connection because he could not separate it from the deception. He was saying that without the truth of her name, the truth of her heart meant nothing. Neshoba stepped up to Dakota's side. "Give the order, cousin. Throw her back to her people. Let them have their lie. We wash our hands of her. If we keep her, we admit we are fools. If you throw her out," Briggs interjected smoothly, "and send her back with her family, I might be persuaded to delay the official report. Perhaps we can renegotiate the treaty terms later." It was a trap. Clara knew it was a trap. Briggs wanted her gone so there would be no witness, no human connection left in the camp. Dakota looked at the soldiers, their hands hovering near their triggers. He looked at his warriors, outnumbered and unprepared for a massacre in the middle of their home. He looked at the women and children watching from the lodge entrances. He had to choose. He could fight for a woman who had lied to him, and risk the lives of his entire tribe in a battle they could not win today. Or he could let her go, sacrifice his own heart, and buy them time. He closed his eyes for a second, and when he opened them, the warmth was gone. The leader had returned. "Go," Dakota said. He did not shout it. He did not say it with hatred. He said it with a terrible, final resignation. "Dakota." Clara reached out. "Go with your family," Dakota said, turning his back on her. "Take your things. Leave my land. The treaty is broken. The bond is severed." He did not say, "I hate you." He did not say, "I never loved you." He simply erased her. He made her a stranger again, and that hurt more than any arrow could have. Clara stood there, her hands suspended in the air. She realized then that there was no fighting this. To stay would be to invite slaughter. Briggs was waiting for an excuse to open fire. If she refused to leave, she would be the reason Ayanna died today, with a dignity that she gathered from the very bottom of her soul. Clara lowered her hand. She did not plead. She did not cry. She turned to Ayanna. The little girl was weeping silently, tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks. She looked from her father's rigid back to Clara. Clara knelt down. She ignored the soldiers, ignored Agnes, ignored the warriors. She pulled Ayanna into a fierce embrace, pressing her face into the child's hair. "Listen to me," Clara whispered fiercely. "You are strong. You are a weed. Remember, you hold the earth together." "Mama, no," Ayanna sobbed, clutching Clara's tunic. "Do not go. God sent you. I have to go," Clara choked out. "But I love you. I love you more than my own life. Never forget that, no matter where I am. I am your mother in my heart." She kissed the top of the child's head, then stood up abruptly, breaking the contact before her resolve crumbled. She walked toward the wagon. She did not look at Agnes. She did not look at Rose. She climbed up onto the wooden seat, her movements stiff and mechanical. "Smart choice," Briggs sneered. He signaled to his men. "Mount up! We are moving out!" The wagon lurched forward. "Mama!" The scream tore through the air, high and desperate. Ayanna tried to run after the wagon. Dakota did not move, but Nashoba did. The young warrior caught the child, holding her back as she kicked and screamed, reaching her small hands toward the retreating vehicle. "Mama, come back, Mama." Clara did not look back. She could not. She sat staring straight ahead at the ears of the mules, her spine rigid, while the sound of her daughter's screams tore her heart into shreds. Tears streamed down her face, silent and unstopped. Dripping onto the deerskin tunic, she still wore the skin of the people she was leaving behind. Dakota stood like a statue as the dust swallowed the wagon. Only when the sound of the wheels had faded did he allow his shoulders to slump. He looked down at his hands, the hands that had held hers on the bow, the hands that had caressed her face. They were empty. He had chosen duty. He had chosen safety for his people. But as the echo of Ayanna's grief filled the camp, he wondered if he had just killed the only part of himself that was truly alive. Night fell over the town of Red Hollow, but it brought no relief from the heat. The air was stifling, thick with humidity and the smell of stale beer from the saloon down the street. In the small, private dining room of the boarding house, Captain Briggs poured himself a glass of brandy. He looked satisfied, like a cat that had just eaten a particularly fat canary. Agnes sat opposite him. She looked older tonight. The adrenaline of the confrontation had faded, leaving her gray and haggard. Rose had been sent to bed, weeping in exhaustion. Clara was nowhere to be seen. She had locked herself in the small attic room Agnes had banished her to, refusing to speak or eat. "So," Agnes said, her voice trembling slightly, "it is done. The treaty is adjusted." "Adjusted," Briggs laughed. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "My dear madam, the treaty is dead, as dead as Julius Caesar, But the protection, Agnes stammered. You said if we exposed Clara, if we set the record straight, we could renegotiate. You said we would get the compensation money. Briggs took a slow sip of his brandy. He looked at Agnes with genuine amusement. You really are a foolish woman, aren't you? He said pleasantly. Agnes bristled. I beg your pardon. You think I care about which sister warms the chief's bed? Briggs leaned forward, his eyes hard and bright. I do not care about brides. Agnes, I care about land. I care about the railroad that wants to come through that valley. And I care about the fact that as long as Lone Hawk holds that pass, civilization stops at the river. He set the glass down with a sharp click. The treaty was an obstacle. Briggs said, I needed a reason to break it. A legal reason, a moral reason. And you gave it to me. I gave it to you. Fraud, Briggs said. Deception. The savages broke faith by harboring an impostor. Or we can say they were complicit in the trickery. It does not matter how I write the report. The result is the same. The agreement is void. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out toward the dark horizon where the Comanche camp lay miles away. At dawn, I am not sending a negotiator, Briggs said softly. I am sending 2 squadrons of heavy cavalry. We're going to clear the valley. We will drive them out, or we will bury them there. Agnes stared at his back. Her mouth fell open. Are you going to attack them, but the women, the child? Collateral damage. Briggs shrugged. It is a war, Agnes, and thanks to your little family drama, I now have the justification to finish it. He turned back to her, smiling cruelly. You should be proud. You did your patriotic duty. You sold one daughter to save the other, and in the process, you gave me the key to the West. Here. He reached into his pocket and tossed a heavy leather pouch onto the table. It landed with the dull thud of coins. Your 30 pieces of silver, Briggs said. Take it. Buy your Rose a nice dress for the funeral. Agnes stared at the money pouch. It was what she had wanted. It was the salvation of her ranch. But as she looked at it, she did not see gold. She saw Ayanna's tear-streaked face. She saw Clara's stoic, heartbroken expression as she climbed into the wagon. She realized with a sickening jolt that she had not just sold Clara. She had signed the death warrant for an entire people. She had traded a human soul for a bag of metal, and the weight of it threatened to crush her into the floor. Oh, God, Agnes whispered, covering her mouth with her hand. What have I done? You did business, Mrs. Monroe, Briggs said, finishing his drink. Now, if you will excuse me, I have a battle to plan. He walked out of the room, leaving Agnes alone with the money and the ghosts gathering in the shadows. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the eaves, sounding like the screams of a child being torn from her mother. The silence that settled over the Comanche camp following the departure of the wagon was not the peaceful quiet of the prairie night. It was a heavy, suffocating weight, pressing down on the buffalo hide lodges like a physical hand. The fires burned low, casting long, wavering shadows that looked too much like ghosts. Inside Dakota's lodge, the air was stagnant. Ayanna sat on her sleeping furs, her small body curled tight around herself. In her arms, she clutched the rough leather doll Clara had sewn for her, its yarn hair matted with the child's tears. A bowl of stew, now cold and congealed, sat untouched beside her. Dakota entered quietly. He had spent the last hour pacing the perimeter of the camp, checking the sentries, trying to walk off the hollow ache in his chest. He looked at his daughter and felt a fresh wave of failure wash over him. He had protected his people's honor today, or so the elders claimed, but looking at the devastation in his daughter's eyes, honor felt like a cold comfort. He knelt beside her. "Little bird," he said softly, his voice rumbling in the quiet space. "You must eat. The winter winds will not wait for your grief." Ayanna did not move. She stared at the wall of the lodge, her eyes swollen and red. Dakota reached out to touch her shoulder, but she flinched away from him. The rejection stung worse than any arrow. "She is gone, Ayanna," Dakota said, trying to keep his voice steady. "It is for the best. She was not who she said she was. We cannot build a life on a lie." Ayanna turned to look at him then. Her dark eyes, usually so full of light, were blazing with a fierce, childish anger that took Dakota's breath away. "She lied," Ayanna whispered. Her voice was raspy from crying, but the English words were distinct. Dakota nodded slowly. "Yes, she lied about her name." "No," Ayanna said, shaking her head violently. "That lady in blue, the one with the yellow hair, she lied." Dakota frowned. "Rose, she is the one named in the paper." Ayanna scrambled to her knees. She gripped the doll with white-knuckled intensity. "She says she is Rose," the child insisted, her voice rising. "But she is not the mama God sent. Clara is. God sent her to me." The words hung in the smoky air, echoing the declaration she had made the night of the sandstorm. "God sent you after all." Dakota stared at his daughter. He felt the world tilt on its axis. He thought back to the moment Briggs had confronted them. He remembered the terrified, fragile woman in the blue dress who looked as if the wind would blow her away. And he remembered Clara standing in the dust, blood on her arm from saving his child, facing down soldiers and warriors with a spine of steel. He remembered the way Clara had learned to string a bow, the way she had whispered the names of the stars in his own tongue, the way she had held him in the dark, not with the hesitation of a stranger, but with the fierce belonging of a woman who had found her home. He had judged her by a piece of paper signed by men who hated them. He had let a name weigh more than the beating heart he had felt against his own chest. "Clara," Dakota whispered. It did not taste like a lie anymore. It tasted like the truth he had been too blind to see. Ayanna began to sob again, a broken, desolate sound. "You sent her away. You sent the mama God gave us away." Dakota stood up abruptly. The lodge felt too small to contain the sudden, expanding realization of his mistake. He had let pride dictate his actions. He had let the fear of being fooled override the evidence of his own soul. He had exiled the woman who had saved his daughter because she dared to be Clara instead of Rose. He turned to the entrance, his hand gripping the hilt of his knife until the leather creaked. He had to fix this. But before he could form a plan, the flap of the lodge was thrown open. Neshoba stood there, his face grim. "Cousin," he said in their tongue, "the scouts report movement near the fort. Too much movement for nightfall." Dakota's eyes narrowed. The grief in his heart was instantly compartmentalized, pushed aside by the warrior's instinct. "What kind of movement?" "Riders," Neshoba said. "Many of them. And wagons moving without lanterns." Dakota looked back at Ayanna, who was watching him with tear-filled, hopeful eyes. He nodded to her, a silent promise, and stepped out into the night, miles away, in the stifling attic room of the boarding house in Red Hollow. Clara sat on the edge of a narrow cot. The room smelled of dust and dry heat. She had not eaten the tray of food Agnes had sent up. She simply stared at the window, watching the moon rise over the distant hills that hid the valley she had come to call home. She heard a key turn in the lock. Clara stiffened, expecting Briggs, or perhaps Rose coming to offer some weeping apology. The door creaked open. Agnes stood there. She held a kerosene lamp in one hand, the light casting deep shadows on her haggard face. In her other hand, she clutched a rolled-up piece of parchment. Agnes looked older than Clara had ever seen her. The stern, imperious mask had cracked, revealing a terrified woman underneath. "Agnes," Clara said, her voice dull, "if you have come to tell me I ruined the family, save your breath. I know." Agnes did not scold. She stepped into the room and closed the door softly. She set the lamp on the small table and unrolled the parchment. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. "Look," Agnes whispered. Clara stood up and walked to the table. It was a map, a military map of the territory. Red lines were drawn across the topography, converging on a specific location near the river bend, the Comanche camp. "What is this?" Clara asked, a cold dread seeping into her veins. "It is Briggs's plan," Agnes said, her voice trembling. "He was drinking. He boasted of it. He left it on the dining table when he went to inspect the horses." She looked up at Clara, her eyes wide with horror. "He is not renegotiating. Clara, he is attacking at dawn." When the men are preparing for the hunt? Clara stared at the map. The red arrows pointed not just to the warriors' positions, but to the rear of the camp, the area where the women and children slept, where Ayanna slept. He said it was collateral damage, Agnes choked out. He said he would clear the valley. He is going to kill them all. Clara, the child, everyone. The room seemed to spin. Clara gripped the edge of the table. You sold them, she hissed, looking at her stepmother. You sold them for a bag of gold. I did not know, Agnes cried, tears spilling down her cheeks. I wanted the money. Yes, I wanted safety for Rose, but I did not want to. I am not a murderer. Clara, I cannot have the blood of children on my soul. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a heavy iron key. She placed it on the map. The back door is unlocked, Agnes said hurriedly. The stable boy is asleep. Take the roan mare. She is the fastest. Clara looked at the key, then at Agnes. For years, this woman had made her life a misery. She had treated her like a servant, sold her like cattle, and lied about her to the world. But at this moment, Agnes was offering the only thing that mattered, a chance. Clara snatched the key. She did not say thank you. There was no time for forgiveness, and perhaps some things could not be forgiven. If they die, Clara said, her voice hard as flint, their blood is still on your hands. Pray that I am fast enough to wash it off. She blew out the lamp, plunging the room into darkness, and ran. Clara moved through the sleeping town like a shadow. She reached the stable, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saddled the roan mare with hands that did not tremble, her fear transmuted into cold, hard purpose. She led the horse out the back way, avoiding the main street where Briggs's sentries might be posted. Once she hit the open prairie, she dug her heels in. Run, she whispered. Run for her. The mare surged forward, eating up the ground. Clara rode not toward safety, but back into the fire. She rode toward the man who had rejected her and the child who had claimed her. She rode to save the people who had called her a liar, because she knew now that truth was not in a name. Truth was in the act of showing up when the sky was falling. Dakota rode hard toward the fort, keeping to the low ground, blending with the shadows of the mesquite brush. He needed to know Briggs's mind. He needed to know if the captain intended to honor the expulsion of the bride, or if he planned further treachery. He tied his horse in a dry wash and crept toward the perimeter of the outpost on foot. The fort was buzzing with activity, far more than was normal for this hour. Lanterns bobbed, men shouted orders, and the heavy rattle of saber sheaths against saddles drifted on the wind. He moved closer, hiding behind a water trough near the officers' quarters. The window was open to let in the night breeze. He heard Briggs' voice, loud and slurred with drink. No prisoners, Briggs was saying. We hit the lodges first. Confusion is our ally. By the time the bucks get to their rifles, the village will be burning. And the treaty, sir? Another voice asked. The treaty was with a ghost. Briggs laughed. The impostor voided it. We are cleaning the house, Lieutenant, tomorrow. This valley belongs to the United States. Dakota felt a rage so pure it nearly blinded him. It was never about the bride. It was never about Rose or Clara. It was always about extermination. Clara had just been the excuse they were waiting for. He slipped away from the window, his movement silent and lethal. He had to go back. He had to warn the camp. They had hours, maybe less. He reached his horse and vaulted onto its back. He turned the stallion toward the canyon, the narrow, twisting cut in the earth that was the only direct path between the fort and the valley. He pushed the black stallion to a gallop. The moon was high now, painting the canyon walls in silver and shadow. The wind rushed past his ears, screaming of war. He rounded a sharp bend in the canyon floor, the horse's hooves striking sparks against the stone. Suddenly, another rider appeared directly in his path, galloping from the opposite direction. Both horses reared, screaming in surprise. Dakota fought for control, his stallion dancing sideways, hooves flailing. He reached for his knife, thinking it was a scout from the fort. Dakota! The voice stopped his hand. The other rider fought to bring the roan mare under control. The horse settled, blowing hard, its coat slick with sweat. In the moonlight, the rider's face was pale, her hair wild and loose around her shoulders. She wore the blue dress of the white world, but she rode with the seat of a Comanche. "Clara," he breathed. She looked at him, her chest heaving, her eyes wide and terrified. She did not look at him with anger for his rejection. She looked at him with desperation. "They are coming!" Clara gasped, breathless. "Briggs, at dawn," he gave the order. "He is coming for the women. For Ayanna." Dakota stared at her. She had been safe. She had been free of them. And yet, here she was, in the middle of the night, risking her life to ride back to the people who had cast her out. "I know," Dakota said, his voice rough. "I heard him." He urged his horse closer until their knees touched. He reached out and grabbed her hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was strong. "You came back," he said. It was not a question. It was a revelation. "I told her," Clara said, tears shining in her eyes. "I told her I would be her mother no matter where I was. Mothers do not run when the wolves come." Dakota looked at her, and the last remnants of his doubt shattered. This woman, with her false name and her fierce heart, possessed more honor than any treaty he had ever signed. "I was a fool," Dakota said intensely. "I looked at the paper and not the woman. Forgive me, Clara." "Save her first," Clara said, squeezing his hand. "Forgive later. We have to move. They will be here when the sun hits the ridge." "We cannot outrun them," Dakota said, his mind shifting to tactics. "If we flee, they will cut us down on the open plain. We must fight." "Here," Clara said, looking up at the towering canyon walls. "They have to come through here. It is the only road for the wagon and the heavy guns." Dakota looked at the narrow pass. It was a bottleneck, a death trap for anyone caught inside when the attack began. "Yes," Dakota said, a plan forming instantly. "We ambushed them here, but the camp, if we miss even one scout, they could flank us." "I will go to the camp," Clara said. "I know the caves in the limestone cliffs behind the river. I took Ayanna there once to look for bats. They are hidden, defensible." Dakota hesitated. "Nashoba will not listen to you. He thinks you are the enemy." Clara lifted her chin. "Then I will make him listen, or I will shoot him in the leg and drag the children to safety myself." Dakota looked at her with a fierce, burning pride. This was his wife, not by law, not by treaty, but by the fire that burned in both their souls. "Go," Dakota said. "Ride like the wind. Wake them. Hide them. Do not come out until the guns stop." "And you?" Clara asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I will hold this door," Dakota promised. "Briggs will not pass." He leaned across the gap between their horses. He grabbed the back of her neck and pulled her to him. He kissed her hard, a desperate, searing seal on their pact. "Ride, Clara Lone Hawk," he whispered against her lips. He gave her his name. He gave her his life. Clara pulled back, nodding once. She turned the roan mare and galloped toward the valley, disappearing into the shadows. Dakota watched her go for 1 second, then turned his stallion back toward the canyon mouth. He reached for his war whistle. It was time to call the ghosts. Clara burst into the sleeping camp like a lightning strike. She did not dismount. She rode straight to the center of the circle and screamed, "Wake up, soldiers, they are coming!" Chaos erupted. Men stumbled from lodges, weapons in hand. Women grabbed their babies. Nashoba emerged from his lodge, his rifle raised. When he saw Clara, his face twisted in rage. "You!" he shouted. "Traitor, you bring them here!" He raised the rifle, aiming at her chest. Clara did not flinch. She rode the mare right at him, forcing him to jump back. She slid from the saddle, landing in the dirt, and marched up to him. She shoved the parchment map Agnes had given her into his chest. "Look at it, you fool!" she screamed. "They are not coming for a parley. They are coming to kill everyone. Briggs plans to hit the lodges first." Nashoba looked at the map. He saw the military markings. He saw the red arrows aimed at the heart of his home. He looked at Clara, standing there unarmed, her blue dress torn, her eyes blazing. "Why?" Nashoba asked. confusion warring with his hate. "Why come back? You were safe." "Because my daughter is here," Clara snarled. "Now, are you going to shoot me, or are you going to help me get these children to the caves?" Nashoba stared at her. He saw the ferocity in her eyes, the same ferocity he had seen in Dakota. He lowered his rifle. "The caves!" Nashoba shouted to the women. "Move everyone to the high rocks fast!" The camp moved with terrified efficiency. Clara ran to Dakota's lodge. Ayanna was standing there, holding her doll, trembling. When she saw Clara, the little girl screamed. "Mama!" Clara scooped her up, burying her face in the child's neck. "I am here. I told you. I am here." "You came back," Ayanna sobbed. "Always," Clara vowed. "Now we have to play a game. The quiet game. We have to go to the caves." She carried Ayanna, hearing the other women, helping the elders. They moved like shadows toward the limestone cliffs that bordered the river. Behind them, the warriors who were not with Dakota were stripping for battle, painting their faces. Nashoba was organizing the defense of the perimeter, but his eyes kept flicking to Clara as she herded the vulnerable into the dark maw of the earth. He nodded to her once, a curt, sharp gesture of respect before turning to face the coming dawn. The sun crested the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and blood red. In the narrow canyon, the shadows were deep and long. Dakota lay flat on the rim of the canyon wall, hidden by the scrub brush. Below him, 20 of his best warriors were positioned among the rocks, invisible to the eye. The sound of wagons echoed off the stone walls. Captain Briggs rode at the head of the column. He looked confident, relaxed. He expected sleeping victims. He expected a slaughter. "Steady," Dakota whispered to the man beside him. The column moved deeper into the canyon. The trap was set. Briggs raised his hand to signal a faster pace. "Double time, we catch them in their blankets." Dakota rose from the brush. He stood silhouetted against the rising sun, a dark, avenging angel. He raised his war whistle to his lips and blew a piercing shriek like a hawk diving for the kill. From the rocks above and the shadows below, the canyon exploded with arrows and gunfire. Panic erupted in the column. Horses screamed and reared. The wagon jackknifed, blocking the retreat. "Ambush!" Briggs screamed, pulling his saber. "Fight, fight, damn you!" Dakota leaped from the low ledge, landing on the back of a soldier's horse. Throwing the man to the ground, he moved like a storm, his war club striking with brutal precision. The battle was joined, but down in the valley, the sound of the guns drifted on the wind, inside the cave. Clara held Ayanna tight, covering the child's ears. She stared out at the sliver of light at the cave entrance, praying to a god she had thought abandoned her, and to the spirits of the land she now claimed. "Hold the door. Dakota," she whispered into the darkness. "Hold the door." Suddenly, the sound of gunfire grew closer. Too close. A group of soldiers had broken through the flank, bypassing the canyon. They were riding toward the cliffs. Clara stood up. She looked at the huddled women and children. She looked at the rifle Nashoba had left leaning against the cave wall. She picked it up. It was heavy, smelling of oil and steel. She checked the chamber. Loaded. She walked to the mouth of the cave. She was not a soldier. She was not a warrior born, but she was a mother. And God help the man who tried to get past her now. The roar of gunfire echoed off the limestone cliffs, turning the sanctuary of the caves into a cacophony of terror. Clara stood at the mouth of the cavern, the heavy Winchester rifle shaking in her hands. She was not a soldier. She was a ranch girl who knew how to shoot a rattlesnake or a lame horse, but she had never aimed a weapon at a human being. Yet, as she looked down the slope at the chaotic skirmish unfolding between the rocks, her fear was eclipsed by a cold, steely resolve. Below, the flanking unit of Briggs's cavalry was pushing hard. They had bypassed the bottleneck of the canyon, intending to slaughter the defenseless families while the warriors were distracted. But they had not counted on the ferocity of the few guards left behind, nor the desperation of mothers defending their young. "Stay back!" Clara screamed, firing a shot that kicked up dirt near the hooves of an advancing horse. The rider swerved, shouting a curse. Inside the cave, women were huddled together, covering their children with buffalo robes. But Ayanna, fueled by the panic of the noise and the sudden separation from her father, had wriggled free from the elder woman holding her. "Papa!" Ayanna cried out. She saw a gap in the fighting, a stretch of open ground leading toward the canyon where Dakota was holding the line. To a child's mind, safety was not a cave. Safety was her father's arms. Before Clara could stop her, Ayanna bolted. "Ayanna, no!" Clara dropped the rifle and scrambled down the scree slope. "Come back!" The little girl ran across the open clearing, her small moccasins kicking up dust. At that exact moment, Captain Harlan Briggs broke through the line of defenders near the creek bed. He was bloodied, his hat gone, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He saw the battle turning against him in the canyon. The ambush had been too effective. He needed a victory. He needed to inflict pain. He saw the child running. He saw the daughter of the man who had defied him. Briggs raised his pistol. He did not hesitate. He did not flinch. He took aim at the small, fleeing figure. Clara saw him. She saw the glint of the sun on the barrel. She saw the cold intent in his eyes. She was 20 feet away from Ayanna. There was no time to shout, no time to reach for a weapon, no time to pray. There was only time to move. Clara threw herself forward. She did not run. She launched herself through the air, her body a desperate projectile of flesh and bone. The crack of the pistol shot shattered the air. Clara collided with Ayanna, tackling the child to the hard earth just as the bullet tore through the space where the girl's heart had been a fraction of a second before. They hit the ground hard, rolling in a tangle of limbs and dust. A sharp, searing heat ripped through Clara's upper left arm, followed instantly by a wave of nausea. "Clara!" The scream came from two throats at once. One was Dakota, who had just crested the ridge to see the horror unfold. The other was Nashoba. Nashoba, the warrior who had called Clara a poison, who had wanted to cast her out to the wolves, stood frozen near a boulder. He had seen everything. He had seen the white captain aim at a Comanche child, and he had seen the white woman, the liar, the imposter, throw her life in front of the bullet without a single thought for her own survival. In that split second, Nashoba's world broke apart and reformed. He realized that the enemy was not the color of skin. The enemy was the darkness in a man's heart that would allow him to murder a child. And the ally was not the one who shared his blood, but the one who spilled hers to save what he loved. Nashoba raised his rifle. He did not aim for the soldiers. He aimed for the man in the blue coat who was cocking his pistol for a second shot at the prone woman and child. "For the innocent," Nashoba roared in Comanche. He pulled the trigger. The shot hit Briggs squarely in the chest. The captain looked down, a look of profound surprise on his face, before he toppled backward from his saddle. He hit the ground and did not move. The architect of hatred, the man who had twisted laws and lives to serve his greed, lay dead in the dirt of the land he had tried to steal. The death of their commander broke the spirit of the remaining soldiers, leaderless, outmaneuvered, and witnessing the sheer ferocity of the Comanche defense. They threw down their weapons or turned their horses to flee back toward the fort. The guns fell silent. The dust began to settle, drifting slowly down over the valley like a morning veil. Dakota sprinted across the clearing. He fell to his knees beside the heap of blue fabric and deerskin. "Clara!" His voice was a broken rasp. "Ayanna!" Clara groaned, shifting slightly. She pushed herself up on her good arm, wincing as pain radiated from her left shoulder. Her sleeve was soaked in bright red blood. Underneath her, Ayanna wiggled, coughing in the dust. The child was unhurt, shielded completely by Clara's body. "She is safe," Clara whispered, her face pale and beaded with sweat. "I got her. She is safe." Dakota looked at the blood on Clara's arm. He looked at the hole in her dress where the bullet had passed through, grazing the muscle. If she had been an inch slower, that bullet would have buried itself in Ayanna's spine. He reached out, his hands trembling violently, and touched Clara's face. He smeared a streak of dust and blood on her cheek, a mark of the battle she had fought for them. "You came back!" Dakota choked out, tears cutting tracks through the war paint on his face. "You took the bullet." Neshoba walked over. He stood over them, his shadow long in the morning light. He looked at the dead body of Briggs in the distance, then looked down at Clara, slowly, deliberately. Neshoba knelt. He placed his hand on his heart and bowed his head to Clara. "No poison," Neshoba said in English, his voice rough with regret and respect. "Sister, you are my sister." It was the highest honor he could give. He was acknowledging that she was no longer a stranger, no longer a white woman to be tolerated. She was the blood of the tribe, forged in the fire of sacrifice. Ayanna sat up, her eyes wide as she looked at the blood on Clara's arm. She did not cry this time. She reached out her small hands and pressed them over the wound, as if she could heal it with her touch. "God sent you?" Ayanna whispered. Her voice was not a question. It was not a plea. It was a statement of absolute, unshakable fact. "God sent you to us." Clara hissed in pain but forced a smile. She leaned her forehead against the child's. "And I will come again," she whispered. 1,000 times. I would always come. The days that followed the Battle of the Canyon were a time of healing and reckoning. The news of Captain Briggs's death and his unauthorized, murderous attack on a peaceful encampment traveled fast. When the reports reached the district headquarters, the scandal was immediate. The army, eager to distance itself from a massacre that had no legal standing and had resulted in the death of a commanding officer, opened an inquiry. The original treaty was indeed void, just as Briggs had claimed. But in its place, a new understanding began to take root. It was not written on paper with government stamps. It was written in the handshake between the new commander of the fort, a man who had seen the carnage Briggs caused, and Dakota. It was written in the way the townspeople of Red Hollow, shamed by the revelation of Briggs's treachery, began to leave sacks of grain and cloth at the edge of the Comanche territory, not as payment, but as apology. Clara's wound was painful, but it was clean. The medicine woman of the tribe, the same grandmother who had once looked at her with scorn, tended to it with poultices of sage and honey. She did not click her tongue in disapproval anymore. She treated Clara with the gentle, reverent hands reserved for a warrior returning from victory. A week after the battle, the elders called a council. The great fire was lit in the center of the village. The night air was cool, signaling the approach of autumn, but the warmth of the flames reached every corner of the circle. Clara sat by the fire, her arm in a sling made of soft doe skin. Ayanna sat beside her, refusing to leave her side for even a moment. Dakota stood before the assembly. He wore clean buckskins, but he carried no weapons. He looked at the faces of his people, the elders, the warriors, the mothers, and then he looked at the guests who sat on the periphery. Agnes and Rose were there. They had not returned to Red Hollow, overwhelmed by guilt and the reality of the violence they had helped instigate. They had stayed to help with the wounded. Agnes, stripped of her arrogance, had spent days washing bandages and carrying water. Rose had helped the women repair the damaged lodges. They were still outsiders, but they were no longer enemies. One of the oldest chiefs, a man named Gray Cloud, stood up. He held a feathered staff in his hand. He spoke in Comanche, his voice cracking with age but carrying the weight of authority. "We have spoken," Gray Cloud said. "The paper from the White Father said we were to receive a woman named Rose. The paper lied." He turned his gaze to Clara. "But the spirits do not read papers." The old man continued. "They read hearts. We have seen a heart that is brave. We have seen a heart that protects the weak. We have seen a woman who bleeds for our children." He walked over to Clara. He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a necklace. It was simple, a leather thong strung with the iridescent blue feathers of a jay and a single, silver concho. "Stand, daughter," Gray Cloud commanded. Clara stood, her legs trembling slightly. The elder placed the necklace around her neck. "This is the circle," he said. "It has no beginning and no end. You are of the people. Your name is no longer a whisper we do not understand. You are Wichapi Hatiwan Evening Star, because you shone brightest when the night was darkest." A murmur of assent went through the crowd. "Evening Star," they echoed. Dakota stepped forward. The crowd fell silent. He looked at Agnes and Rose, acknowledging their presence with a solemn nod, effectively granting them amnesty for their past sins. Then, he turned his back on the rest of the world and focused entirely on Clara. He looked at the woman with the sling on her arm and the dust on her hem. He looked at the woman he had tried to send away, and who had loved him enough to disobey. "I do not need a bride on paper," Dakota said, his voice ringing out clearly in both Comanche and English, so that every ear could understand. "I do not need a political alliance. I do not need a peace offering." He took a step closer, invading her space, wrapping her in his presence just as he had done on the black stallion so many weeks ago. "I need the woman who held my daughter in the sandstorm," he said softly. "I need the woman who stood in front of a bullet. I need the woman who rode into the dark when she could have walked into the light." He reached out and took her good hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Clara Monroe," he said, speaking her true name like a prayer. "That is the name I carry in my heart. Will you be my wife, not because of a treaty, not because of a debt, but because you hold my soul in your hands? Will you take me in the way of the Comanche, and in the way of your own heart?" Clara looked at him. Tears spilled from her eyes, hot and fast. She thought of the lonely girl who had scrubbed floors in Red Hollow, the girl who was never enough, the girl who was sent as a substitute. That girl was gone. She had died in the canyon, and this woman, Evening Star, mother, wife, had risen in her place. "Yes," Clara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Dakota, I will." She did not need to shout it. The look in her eyes was loud enough to be heard by the moon. Dakota smiled a brilliant, unguarded smile that erased years of war from his face. He leaned down and kissed her, right there in front of the elders and the soldiers and her weeping stepmother. It was a kiss of promise, of homecoming. Suddenly, a small body wedged itself between their legs. Ayanna squeezed in. Grabbing Dakota's leg with one hand and Clara's skirt with the other, she looked up at them, beaming, her face glowing in the firelight. "Finally," Ayanna declared, her voice piping up in the silence. "Now God can rest. He did his job." For a second, there was silence. And then, a ripple of laughter started. It began with Clara, a bubbling sound of pure joy. Dakota joined in, his deep baritone rumbling in his chest. The elders chuckled. Even Agnes, sitting in the shadows, found herself smiling through her tears. The tension of the war, the fear of the last few days, dissolved in the warmth of that laughter. It was the sound of a family knitting itself together, flawed and scarred and perfect. Time moved differently on the plains. It did not move by the ticking of a clock, but by the turning of the seasons. The winter came, hard and cold, but the lodge of Dakota was warm. The supplies from the new trade agreements kept hunger at bay, but it was the warmth of the fire inside that truly sustained them. Then came the spring, bringing rain and wildflowers that carpeted the valley in purple and gold. And then, the summer. 6 months after the battle, the prairie was a sea of green grass rippling under the July sun. Clara stood outside the lodge. She wore a dress of soft, bleached doe skin, intricately beaded by her own hand. Her hair hung loose and long, shining in the sun. She rested one hand on the small of her back and the other on the swell of her stomach. The new life growing inside her was strong. It kicked with the vigor of a pony. Ayanna sat near her feet, weaving a crown of wildflowers. The girl had grown taller, her limbs lengthening, her English now flawless, though she preferred to speak Comanche with her mother. "Mama," Ayanna asked, holding up the flowers, "do you think the baby will like yellow?" "I think the baby will like anything you give him." Clara smiled, reaching down to stroke Ayanna's hair. "Or her. It is a boy," Ayanna said confidently. "I dreamed of a little wolf." The sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. Dakota was returning from a patrol. He rode the black stallion, leading a string of wild horses he had captured and broken. He saw them standing there, his wife and his daughter, and he slowed his horse. He watched them for a moment, drinking in the sight. He was a man who had known too much death, but now His world was filled with life. He dismounted and walked toward them. He did not look like the fearsome, bloody warrior anymore. He looked like a man who had found his center. He kissed Clara, his hand resting gently on her stomach. The little warrior sleeps. He is awake. Clara laughed. He knows his father is home. Things had changed in Red Hollow too. The town was no longer a place of fear. Wagons moved freely through the pass, paying a toll that went to the tribe, ensuring prosperity for both sides. In a small cabin near the edge of the town, Agnes Monroe sat at a table. Around her sat 6 children, 3 white, 3 Comanche. She pointed to the letters on a slate board. A is for apple, Agnes said patiently. B is for bear. She looked tired, and her hands were rougher than they used to be, but there was a peace in her eyes that had never been there when she was chasing status. She was teaching the children of 2 worlds to speak to one another, paying her debt 1 letter at a time. Rose had married a young lieutenant who respected the treaty, and she often visited the camp, bringing fabric and news, bridging the gap between sisters that had once seemed unbridgeable. The story ends on a quiet evening, with the sky painted in the impossible oranges and pinks of a Texas sunset. Clara and Ayanna sat on the high ridge overlooking the valley. The wind was gentle, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Ayanna leaned her head on Clara's shoulder. She watched the first star appear in the darkening sky, the evening star, Clara's namesake. You know, Ayanna said thoughtfully, twisting a blade of grass in her fingers, I used to think the spirits made a mistake when they took my first mama. Clara put her arm around the girl, pulling her close. We cannot know the mind of the spirits, little bird. We only know the path they lay before us. I know, Ayanna said. She looked up at Clara, her eyes wise beyond her years. I think sometimes God sends the right person under the wrong name. He knew we needed you. He knew I needed a mama who could fight the wind. So he sent you in a disguise. Clara smiled, tears pricking her eyes. She looked out over the land, the wild, beautiful, brutal land that had broken her and then put her back together stronger than before. She thought of the lies, the pain, the blood, and the fear, and she knew she would endure it all again for this single moment of peace. It does not matter what name we carry when we arrive, Clara whispered, kissing Ayanna's forehead. It only matters who we love when we stay. They sat there as the sun dipped below the horizon. A woman and a child bound not by blood, but by a choice. Below them, the fires of the camp flickered to life, mirroring the stars above, a constellation of family, loyalty, and love burning bright in the heart of the Wild West. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed this journey of love, courage, and redemption on the American frontier. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below, letting me know where in the world you are listening from. It is always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed Clara and Dakota's story, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales. Don't forget to hit the like button and press the hype button to help this video get discovered by more people. Your support means the world and helps me continue to bring these stories to life. Thank you, and see you on the next trail.